Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Veritas. Welcome to our moderated discussion tonight between AnticitizenX and Renaissance Man, also known as Elliot on this server. Tonight's discussion, as I understand it, is going to be about philosophy, God, and Thomism. Welcome, guys. I'll give you each a chance to introduce yourselves. Let's start with you, Elliot.
Hey, I'm known as Renaissance Man on YouTube. I picked it. It might be a bit cringe, but it works in the SEO, so I picked it for that. I am a graduate student in advanced computer science, specializing in computational intelligence. Specifically, my thesis will probably be on something to do with the virtues and how they correspond to evolutionary algorithms. So I was an atheist for most of my teenage years, but after discovering, first of all, that it's boring, and second of all, that it isn't correspondent to reality, I became a Roman Catholic under the influence of Thomism and of the Church Fathers. And I think that's all you really need to know. There's not much else to say.
All right. Thanks, Elliot. AnticitizenX, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks. So I've got a YouTube channel. I guess I'm moderately famous. My background is in electrical engineering. I have a PhD, and I'm an instructor of electrical engineering, and I do a lot of industry work and consulting. I was raised as a Mormon, of all things, and kind of left the church when I was in my early 20s, and spent a lot of time like sniffing out all what other religions had to offer, and kind of developed a passion for philosophy and the arguments in philosophy of religion along the way, and developed my YouTube channel from there.
All right. Well, thank you both for being here. As we said, tonight's format is more of a moderated discussion, not really a formal time debate of any kind. So we'll just let you guys get started. We just ask that, as we know, these kind of discussions can get passionate and heated at times. We just ask to be respectful and to keep ad hominems and personal attacks out of the discussion. So whoever feels like starting, go for it.
I'll start because I actually went through and watched some of your content, X.
Mm-hmm.
And I watched your discussion with Matt Dillahunty, who was someone who I used to watch a lot as a teenager, on Essentialism. So as the stream is about Thomism, it is necessary to get an understanding of Essentialism, because fundamentally Thomism is founded on an essentialist framework. And in order to do so, I think it really makes sense, because you don't sound particularly satisfied in that stream with the nominalist position which you're taking, right? So for those who don't know, nominalism is the position wherein, there are only names. There aren't any such things as abstract categories. There aren't universals. And this is something that is, of course, necessary for Thomism. St. Thomas quotes the organon quite consistently in his works, Posterior Analytics, but the one that's relevant here is the categories.
Can you define kind of Thomism a little while you're at it? I'm kind of curious what that means to you.
Thomism. Thomism is the Catholic tradition of that comes from St. Thomas Aquinas, but it's not just Aquinas, it's other figures like Cardinal Cajetan, who wrote in the 16th century, through to more modern thinkers like Edward Feser and Peter Kreeft. But it is essentially founded on, essentialism as posited by Aristotle, which is why I think it's necessary to expound that first before we get onto anything exciting like the 5 ways.
So Thomism, is there more to it than just like it's what St. Thomas Aquinas thought, or are there like certain like really key defining themes or features about it? And like, why would you say essentialism is essential to Thomism?
Well, let's start with your first question here. So yeah, it's essentially the philosophy of St. Thomas expounded over the 7th century since his death. And since St. Thomas wrote a huge amount, he wrote roughly 6 pages a day for his entire life in the Dominicans, there's quite a lot to assess. There's, of course, the famous Summa Theologiae, which covers essentially very short arguments for particular aspects of church teaching, from, of course, the existence of God to the species of particular sin. And being so complicated, there have been many commentators on it and people who have expounded on it. Like I said, Cardinal Cajetan in the 16th century. You have Father Garrigou Lagrange, who I think would be important for refuting a lot of atheism and also the New Age movement, who wrote in the beginning of the 20th century through to, I think he survived the Second World War, actually. Not sure exactly when he died. I think he might have died before the Second Vatican Council. Jacques Maritain as well, another French philosopher of the beginning of the 20th century. And as we see them right now, people like Edward Fazer and Dr. Peter Kreeft, as well as the entire Thomistic Institute on YouTube. What was the other question? Sorry.
Oh, so I was just asking, like, what are some of the key features of Thomism? Not just like who are the key figures, but what makes like Thomism, and not say
evangelical.
And then
evangelical
important to it.
Okay, so Thomism is essentially, I mean, it's not the only school. There are many schools of Aristotelian Christianity. I mean, you could say that a lot of the reformers took this kind of tact. I think Heinrich Bullinger did. The systemizer of the theology of Martin Luther, for those who don't know. But specifically, what makes Thomism, in the context of Aquinas himself, is the expression of Catholic doctrine in terms of Aristotelian language. But like I say, it's not the only form of this, because as Aquinas makes very clear in his first question in the Summa, the philosophy is distinct from the theology. Theology deals with revealed truth and with images, whereas philosophy is used to categorize the revealed truths and expound them. It's not something that's reasoned so much as making it clear to people so that they can understand. So it's basically a means by which to interpret the Catholic faith, although there are Thomists who aren't actually Catholic. I think Mortimer Adler was a Jewish one until he converted to Catholicism, funnily enough. But yeah.
So would you say like all Thomists are Catholics, but not necessarily all Catholics are Thomists?
I would not say that all Catholics are Thomists. My priest, actually, who graduated from Oxford with his PhD in theology, right? He's a Scotist, and they are different. They have different views on being, and they have a more Eastern view of the nature of God. So, for example, Aquinas will say that God is actus purus, whereas, say, Blessed John Duns Scotus, who's the origin of the Scotist tradition, with others like St. Maximus the Confessor, will say that God is beyond being.
Okay, so why is essentialism so essential to your theology?
Because you need to have a hard grasp on reality and what it actually is, and particularly the existence of universals before you can argue for things like, say, the existence of immaterial things such as God. For we learn from the Gospel of John that God is spirit, as well as to argue for the immaterial mind and soul. So you need to have that framework there before you can go about expounding more profound and more important truths. Maybe not more important, but more sophisticated truths.
So you said you need universals and essentials for truth?
I would say that if you're going to be it really depends what we mean by truth, right? In the Thomistic tradition, truth is the correspondence of one's mind to reality. So, for example, I look at the cup on my table. I say that it is white and it has black letters that spell out scan.co.uk, because that's where I got my laptop from. That is my mind corresponding to reality. Is true that particular object possesses those particular properties.
Because I hear that and I think truth is the far more fundamental thing than, say, essentialism. Because that's also the thing I'm a lot more familiar with in experience, is kind of the foundations of epistemology.
No, I would disagree, because you have to decide what reality is before you can determine what truth is. Truth is contingent on what we decide, or what we maybe not decide what reality is, but what reality is. Before, like, you can't decide truth, like absolute correspondence to reality, say with a scientific experiment where there's probabilities involved. It has to be like a brute fact, I think they call it in modern philosophy.
Because I subscribe to a more semantic theory of truth, where it's not truth is just a word, right? And it means whatever we kind of want it to mean. And you're not going to get very far unless we agree on some kind of definition for like, what is truth really? But how do I recognize truth when I see it? So I like that you mentioned, the correspondence theory, because that's very intuitive. But a big question I would have, and one of my biggest objection to that is, like, what does it mean for a proposition to correspond with some fact in objective reality? So to say truth is that which corresponds with reality, to me, is just pushing the question back once more. Well, how do I tell if some proposition is correspondent? How do I recognize that when I see it? So, to me, like, it doesn't make sense to talk about whether essentialism is true or not without defining what truth is. How do I recognize truth when I see it?
Okay, so if I were to stick, say, a burning hot pointer, right, in the fire. If you've ever read Ibn Sina, you'll know this one. If I stick a burning hot poker in the fire and I place the burning hot poker on your arm, does it objectively hurt?
Then that's going to kind of depend what you mean by objective, because pain is a subjective phenomenon unto itself. So a lot of people would say you can't objectively feel things. That's a subjective experience in that sense.
So you're telling me that, because I don't know whether or not you're a leper, I can't actually burn you?
No, I'm just saying the feeling of pain and burning is a subjective experience. So that this is yet another rabbit hole, by the way, is that objective subjective dichotomy. To me, those are words that get thrown around a lot, but you got to kind of be careful what they mean as well.
Okay, I think I understand. So so you wouldn't say that it's objectively correspondent to reality that if I were to take the burner out of the fire and apply it to your arm, that I wouldn't be arrested for grievous bodily harm?
Say that. So you're saying if you poke me with a hot poker, you will be arrested?
No, like if I place the fire on your arm, like, I don't mean just poking, I mean specifically applying it over a larger area, you don't think that would lead to objective grounds for my arrest?
So when you say objective grounds, again, like, is this what people have determined by law, or you just mean the consequences of your actions?
Well, I mean both. I mean both, because I don't think that the consequences of laws can be removed from the species of the law itself.
Because I'm a pragmatist, right? So to me, consequentialism is the foundation of what it means to say something is objective.
I just need a refresher on something. What pragma means in Greek. Pragma. Because if I remember correctly, it corresponds to truth.
Well, there's
pragma, or long-standing love.
Thought on it.
Pragma. Yeah, I'm well aware of the pre-existing the psychological pragmatist arguments of the 19th century philosophers. I just want to check what it actually means. I do and practice. Okay, so it means deed, act, or fact. Okay, so you're a truthist. You believe in correspondence to reality.
I do, but there's a little asterisk to say that I define correspondence through, say, actions and consequences. That is how you measure whether or not some proposition has any correspondence in reality.
Right, okay, so if I were to say, do a mathematical sum, and I said that 2 + 2 = 5. Now, this would just be something on a piece of paper, and it would be an abstract intellectual object. I think we can both agree on that, right? Mm-hmm. So you're telling me that there wouldn't be any means from the world of telling, like, of itself, I don't mean as applied to, say, electrical circuits or to computer programs or whatever. There would be no means by which we could obtain knowledge as to whether or not 2 + 2 is true or false, because we can't actually express it in the material world.
So this is now where the analytic synthetic distinction comes in, because when I was talking about consequentialism, there should be a little asterisk saying that is limited to the context of a synthetic proposition. When you're talking about things like mathematical theorems, those are analytic in nature because they are purely derived out of axioms and rules of inference. So
yeah, I think the morality is the same, and so does Thomas. So, like, I reject any sort of is-ought distinction or lack of oughts as comes from Hume. I believe that everything is an ought, including logic. But logic itself is an ought because that's part of what constitutes God. In archi ke ho logos, as it says in the Gospel of John. In the beginning, there was the Word, and logos, of course, relates to logic as it relates to reality, as it relates to word. So no, they are. I would disagree that there is much of a distinction. I think that there is. I don't think there's any distinction there. I disagree.
So you reject the analytic synthetic distinction entirely?
Well, I've never come across it in anything of St. Thomas, and as I'm here to represent the Thomist tradition, I would say yes, but you'd probably be better off talking to a professor like Ed Fazer on something like this. I'm a computer scientist by trade, and I'm more interested in the moral side of things, but this is what my gut is telling me.
Okay, because I mean, all it really says at the end of the day is some things are true because we need rules of language in order to communicate, right? You know, when I tell you a bachelor is an unmarried man, that is not really made true by any correspondence in reality. It's true because we all collectively got together as English speakers and have agreed that that's just what the word shall mean when we use it in practice, right?
Oh yeah, I know where this comes from.
So
this is nominalism. Yeah, I reject it.
Okay.
Yeah, you see. Okay, so you see the problem that you made with the mistake that you made with Dillahunty was that you failed to make the distinction between the signifier, which is the word, and the correspondent reality that it represents. So, for example, in English, I could say the man hits the dog. In Latin, I could say vir canis or canem pulsat. Right? They would still mean the same thing, and this isn't because some council of human beings decided to make it so. Otherwise, you'd have if the signifiers were not linked by some sort of underlying truth, it would be very difficult to translate things. Like the signifier is largely irrelevant to the actual underlying logos. I think Wittgenstein talked about this actually. But yeah, you know, you're mixing up the signifier with the logos. The signifier is entirely arbitrary, but we can translate across them because of that logos that underlies both the existence of immaterial categories.
So let me see if I understand it. So you're kind of saying like the word dog could be the word itself, you know, dog, perro, hound. Those are all arbitrary, but out there in the world, there are these things that manifest in our experience, which we have decided to use that word dog to describe.
There are categories of observations of human beings that correspond such that we can all point out what a dog is, right? It's not us simply deciding it's a dog because I said so. It's like, okay, so this dog has, it has whiskers on its nose, it barks, and it has 4 legs. And whenever we observe, say, for example, a dog with 3 legs, we notice the corruption in the dog, and we still say it's a dog anyway because it's very evident that there's a decay. We say this corresponds to an abstract category that is immaterial in the human mind. In fact, this is actually the mistake that I noticed with the ship of Theseus, which you mentioned earlier on. But you know what? We'll bring that up a bit later on because I'm sure you've got some sort of response to give to that there because I've given you something to think about.
Well, because what you're talking about, I would just simply describe in terms of we have shared experiences. If I was alone, isolated on a desert island, I could give whatever words I wanted to whatever experience I wanted. But if there's another person on the island with me, we have to have some kind of shared experience to give language to. So that shared experience is the foundation of what makes language work. And it sounds like you're sort of describing that with that sort of that foundational truth sort of thing. But I would say truth is entirely the wrong word just to use for that. It's a shared experience is how language works.
Yeah, you see, you're presupposing that there's an abstract category on which to impose the signifier, which is the problem in the first place. Yes, you could have a human being like alone on an island. He could decide that a tree is Protozymvoli or something like that, which is actually a Byzantine tax collector. And you would have 2 people on an island, and they may well they may well understand the signifier to respond to that category, but the signifier itself is irrelevant. When we're discussing these sorts of things, we are talking about the underlying logos there, the underlying reality. And we observe this because, say, for example, with the dog. Actually, the dog's a bad example. Say a parrot. A parrot can, of course, speak these signifiers, but I can't hint at the fact that Polly's going to get a cracker through metaphor. Which is there to hint at another abstract concept. So you can't just simply say there's just the word and that's it, and we've just decided.
So what you talked about this idea of an underlying reality, and all I said is we need a shared experience. And this is why it is fundamentally impossible to communicate the meaning of red to someone who has been blind their entire life. There is no foundation of shared experience by which they can relate or assign meaning to that word. So you say underlying truth. I don't even know what that means. We do have a shared experience.
Okay. Let me ask you a question. Do you think that red doesn't exist for a blind person?
No, it doesn't.
So
red is a subjective perception.
Okay, so then how can I talk to, like, say like a blind person and like talk about redness and explain it through language then?
You can try and explain it, but they will never fundamentally grasp what red is unless you try to use some sort of shared analogy through something that they can experience.
Wait a minute. So you mean like the colorblind person can't see red, right? And the red doesn't exist for the blind person, right?
For the blind person, yeah. And existence kind of is a loaded term. Like, they just can't experience.
Is in being. No, I disagree. Like, for something to exist, it has to be in being. So you're telling me that if we were to use shared experience, that would mean that if we, as human beings, could not perceive something as an entire whole, that would mean it wouldn't exist.
Yeah, for all practical purposes, if you can't perceive it, what does it even mean to speak of such a thing existing? What is the difference between a thing that exists and that does not exist, which cannot be perceived or differentiated one way or the other?
Right, so then how can we discover things?
Because we perceive them in some way or another.
Yeah, but you've just said that if we don't perceive it, it doesn't exist.
And when we do perceive it, if it can be perceived, then that is how you know it exists.
So you're telling me that when we observe something, it just suddenly goes from non-existence to existence?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying if something cannot be perceived, even in principle, what does it mean to speak of its existence in any sense? Like, you can kind of pontificate its existence, but you can never know it for sure one way or the other.
But that's not what I asked. What I asked you is it existent regardless of our shared experience? And you said no. So then there would be no means of discovering anything. Now I'm positing
let me clarify then. Like what you're talking about, something like a subjective perception, like redness or hunger. Like, are you saying?
No, I'm saying that redness, although it doesn't exist outside of the instantation of the particular objects that possess redness, it still exists as an abstract category in the immaterial mind. Yes.
So hunger, red, pain, these are things that exist like objectively unto themselves. That is, if we all just died tomorrow and ceased to exist, redness would still be there? Is that kind of what you're saying?
There would still be red things. Yes.
That is absolutely not true. Red is not a property of objects. It is a property of your brain's interpretation of the signals entering your photons.
No, it's not.
There is an entire
I can tell you why.
Called color theory. How do you think your display works on your screen? It simply tweaks wavelengths of light through varying measures, which our eyes have evolved to subjectively interpret in varying.
Wait, you mean with like a 700 nanometer wavelength that would still exist after human beings cease to be?
The waves and photons are fundamentally there, but redness itself is your perception of the stimulus as interpreted by your brain.
Wait, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to recover from the fact that you said that if human beings died out, there wouldn't be red things.
Right. Red is an entirely fictitious perception inside your mind. It is not a property of an object itself, intrinsically to be red. If your brain interpreted colors differently, red would cease to be, and it would just be some other color scheme instead.
So you're telling me that... Right, okay, so for example, if I were to assert that you were a woman, right, and it was my subjective experience from what I've seen from you, like, obviously I've seen from you that you're a man, I can tell from the tone of your voice, but suppose I had a less maybe strong grasp on tones of voice and I were to suggest you're a woman, would that be true?
No.
So you're innately a man?
Yes. Well,
and so things are innately red.
Term. So
things are innately red. Oh wait. So things can possess innate qualities. That's very interesting, isn't it?
And that's why I said innately is a very loaded term there. So innate, like what do you mean by innate per se?
Yeah, right. So something that is possessed by the nature of the particular thing. So you are by nature a man, and you will never be a woman.
So the question there is like by nature. In an essentialist perspective, is there some like universal essential of maleness inherent to my material atoms? Then the answer is no. Nothing is inherently essentially anything by that standard, because that essentialist concept is incoherent from the beginning. If, however, you were to ask yourself in terms of what are the defining characteristics of a man in terms of the word itself, and what are the measurable tests we can perform to differentiate men from women, then you have an objective foundation by making that distinction.
There's literally no difference between what I'm saying here and what you're saying. The difference is that you're using arbitrary scientific language, right? Like I can point to a duck, it quacks like a duck, it flies like a duck, it has webbed feet like a duck, it's a duck, right? But you'd say no, it can actually be a cat.
Sort of. Like, again, essentialism. It depends on what you mean by essentialism. Because, like, when I'm talking about essentialism, I'm talking about there is some like force essence of duckiness that like permeates the atoms of ducks that makes them ducks. In contrast, there is no essence of that. There are, however, words, which we have to give definitions, and there are common experiences that we feel, or experiences, sensations that we manifest from our experience of the world, which we assign labels to and then give measurable tests for making
Okay. Like I just can't help but imagine that if I were to put a iron poker into the fire, heat it up, and apply it to your hand, you wouldn't feel pain. You'd be asking what it meant to be hot. Like it seems like something that doesn't actually exist in reality. And as philosophy is the love of wisdom, I don't see how this can be called wisdom.
I can feel subjective sensations. If you poke me with a red hot poker, I will necessarily, through physics and sense perception, feel pain.
Wait a minute. But I thought that red and hot were just subjective categories, as opposed to corresponding to some abstract reality.
What do you mean by abstract reality? They are subjective perceptions. So
okay, so if I don't,
perception is objective.
But you're telling me that like the perception of the red hot poker is like subjective. So you're gonna like, what is this red hotness that is being applied to my flesh? What does that smell? You see, the signifier doesn't matter, as I've told you. The underlying like abstract object that is being talked about is the concern here. This is what logos is. This is what the word is as it's described in the scriptures, and what the correspondence theory of truth is. Right? We're not talking about words. We're not talking about arbitrary subjective human constructs here. We're talking about humans intellecting about reality and coming to objective conclusions that are held in a immaterial. Like in an immaterial object.
That's all wonderful, but you still need language rules by which to communicate this stuff. And I can feel pain. That is a fact. But what do you mean? What does it mean to say that pain is objective when it is literally a subjective perception? So this is what I was trying to mention earlier.
I don't think it is.
Dichotomy is kind of flimsy in that sense. So
no. I think that I think that if like the red hot poker were applied to my arm, I'd squeal very loudly, and I think that almost everyone would who doesn't have leprosy. So I'm not sure how this is subjective in any sense. It's not like some people feel like a lovely tingling, happy, lovey-dovey feeling when they're burnt with the hot poker.
Okay, so you're using the word subjective differently from what I would understand it then. That's what I'm trying to get you to is explain what that distinction is all about. Like you can say you objectively are feeling pain per se, but the pain itself is just your brain reacting to stimulus. So What
So
does
it's
it mean to
objective.
say that that's an objective thing when the very essence of it is a subjective experience? So I'm not trying to like, disagree, but like clarify how you draw that distinction.
I'm surprised I have to do this, but okay. So objective is something that is true. It is correspondent to reality. Subjective is something that we interpret and cogitate about, and it may have some objective basis, but it's not something that is clearly objectively true. So, for example, like married bachelors, right? Like that would be something that is objectively false. This is something that is a contradiction. However, a particular interpretation, I don't know, of Isaiah chapter 7 in the scriptures, that could be more subjective to some extent, but I don't think that's...
So you just defined objective and subjective entirely differently from how the overwhelming majority of sources I've seen it, which is not bad. It's just, let's be very clear that your definition is not the universal definition.
Well, yeah, we're talking about Thomism, aren't we?
I'm talking about the definition of objective and subjective.
Yeah, and we're talking about the Thomist tradition, so I'm giving you what is meant by those words in that tradition.
Okay, but then you don't get to fault me for having a slightly different understanding and miscommunicating with you about those terms.
Well,
so I am using those terms differently from how you do.
Well, I mean, I also think that the vast majority of people outside of academia would also say the same thing. But anyway, go ahead and explain what you mean by objective and subjective, please.
So every time I've looked this up, the idea of objective means independent of human thought or preference, right?
So nothing then.
So nothing to you is independent of human.
Well, if we're talking
something you hold to,
if we're talking about truth, then as it's the mind's correspondence to reality, then since it belongs to the mind, then it can't be independent of the human mind. It's a perception.
So it sounds like you're saying, under your view, nothing is objective by that definition.
Yeah, but you're just going to use that to say, well, everything's subjective with you. I'm using a different definition here. This is why that's going to be a problem. So anyway, go on. What are you saying by
you don't get to get upset because I use words slightly differently. I'm trying to clarify these terms so that we can.
I'm not getting so much. I'm not getting so much upset as quite confused, and I think this does actually come from modern philosophy, because it seems like a very strange, false, frankly, a perception of reality. But yeah, do go on with subjective.
So the idea is like, it is subjective to say ice cream is better than cake, right? That is.
I don't know, mate. If you were in my country, you'd end up in the gulag for saying
that. But it would not be subjective to say that ice cream is comprised of milk, cream, and sugar. So there are matters of fact and matters of opinion. But then you get this sort of
So you've just described an essence. Okay, actually, this actually serves a good purpose, because I can actually explain what substantial forms are, because this is one of the mistakes you made. Let's use another example that's more clear. Water, right? H2O. Okay. So H2O. We agree that water is composed of 2 hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom, right?
Okay.
If I were to add 1 hydrogen atom to this, it would become something that isn't water, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So we agree that there are such things as substantial essences.
No.
That's what that is, though. It's a substance.
So what you call a substantial essence, it sounds to me like is just a definition.
So, but like it's not water if I add like an extra hydrogen atom, though.
It is not water, subject to the definition that water is 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen.
You see, this is the mistake that keeps going on. We are not, like, categories are not these sorts of like strange, completely, devoid of like grounding in reality things that we just sort of randomly magic out of existence. They are there based on intellection, and they correspond to features about reality, right? So, like, for example, we know for a fact that water, which is a signifier, corresponds to H2O as a, like a chemical symbol, right?
Prove it.
And prove it.
Prove it right now. Prove that fact to me right now.
Well, that water is water.
No, you said water is H2O.
Yes, that's the signifier we use to describe that reality. Yes.
Okay, so that is true by rote definition then, which is fine. I'm okay with that. But you're calling this like some sort of weird essence that water is H2O is this objectively true thing that was always true and shall forever be true? Or could we just arbitrarily decide tomorrow that I think H3O should also be included in the category of water?
No, we couldn't do that. But that's because you're mixing up the signifier. Like, we could use the signifier water to refer to dog, but the category which is pointed to by that signifier in our parlance does not change.
So the stuff out there independent of my brain, the atoms themselves, arranging in a way, is the objective thing that we are calling water then?
Yes.
Is that kind of what you're getting at? Because
yes,
so it sounds a lot like that analytic synthetic distinction idea again. Because it's one thing to say, I define the word water to denote 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen in a molecule. It's another thing entirely to say that clear liquid stuff coming out of my faucet is water. So those are 2 entirely separate propositions that have to be measured by different truth assignment functions. So the definition is whatever we arbitrarily want it to be. We don't have to make water H2O if we decide that H3O is in fact a thing. And in fact, if you hold a cup of water in your hand, there will be H3O in it by the simple collision of those molecules. So who is to say there's water or not in that? Those little arrangements of electrons and protons.
I'm sorry, but I think it'd be rather strange if I were to go to the faucet, pull it down, and it was snot. I think that would be rather strange. It would still be a clear liquid that comes out of a faucet, but I find that rather strange. But I still don't. I see. You see, you're still mixing up the signifier with the logos, right? That underlies it, the reality that underlies it, which is like the word itself is utterly irrelevant. I could call it dog, I could call it cat, I could call it water, but it would still be water in the sense of the category that when we speak is corresponding to that actually existent category.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're saying that there's the language we have, and then there's the actual stuff outside of our perceptions that's objectively there whether we like it or not. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Pardon, can you repeat that? I was reading a DM.
So there's our language, the labels we assign to things, and then there's the material stuff independent of our perception that's just there and will still be there whether we think about it or not, or if we all go extinct, right?
Yes, like redness.
So you think redness will exist even if we all go extinct?
There will be red things in existence if we all go extinct, yes.
So you think redness is an inherent property of the thing itself and will remain a thing itself even if we all went extinct tomorrow?
Yes, I'm looking at a red picture right now. Actually, good question. This is something that the guy who I was reading asked me to ask you, and frankly, I've been actually mulling this over myself, but I'm not sure if I actually wanted to ask a question like this, but I'll go ahead and ask you anyway. Do you think that reality is defined by human beings?
No.
Okay.
The word, but there's the stuff independent of our experience that will be there and do whatever it does, whether we like it or not. Is that kind of what you mean? Or am I a subscriber to mind-independent realism? Is that a little more formal way to say it? Then yes.
Okay, so if you're a subscriber to mind-independent realism, then why do you have a problem with essentialism?
Because the Thesis Paradox renders it incoherent.
No, okay, that's actually an interesting thing, because you got it the wrong way around with when you were talking to Matt Dillahunty. You assumed that it was the ship that defines the wood, when it's actually the wood that has the ship. The ship itself doesn't actually exist as anything but something in the mind, right? The wood, the substantial form which we've actually been describing here, I don't actually know the chemical formula for wood. It's probably some sort of hydrocarbon, like some sort of carbohydrate, like you know, chemists who are watching this, I'm sorry, I am somebody who does AI. This is not my area of expertise.
You don't have to give the
I'm keeping it a bit light. Yeah. The ship of Theseus, right? Like, it's the wood, which is the matter, has the form of the ship, right? So it doesn't actually. Where was I going with this? The ship doesn't actually exist as anything outside of our minds, but the thing is that we can still speak of the ship of Theseus as existing. as well, because it may not have grounding in the same way as a substantial form, which we've just described here with water, but it has existence as what is known as an accidental form. So it's specifically an artifact. So human beings, say we build like this mug that I talked about earlier on, right? It's composed of porcelain and it has paint on it, right? This obviously, in terms of, if we were to summarize its substantial forms, we would be talking about the porcelain, we'd be talking about the paint. But we're describing an accidental form, which is the mug. And likewise with the ship of Theseus. So we have not described the wood, we have described the ship, which is the accidental form from it, and it exists in the mind. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the picture painted by that Renaissance painter, I want to say it's Caravaggio, where you have Plato pointing upwards and you have Aristotle pointing forwards, and we're describing Aristotle pointing forwards here. You know, the forms don't exist in some realm of forms. They exist in the human mind, but they still nonetheless exist. All right.
So you just said something kind of interesting. So you're saying those forms don't exist in like a Platonic realm. You said they exist in the mind.
But
they're still kind of an anti-Platonist then.
I wouldn't say it's completely anti-Platonist. I think to be anti-Platonist would be to deny forms in themselves. But they do, like, what I want to stress is that they are still in being. We couldn't cogitate about them if they weren't in being. But they're not necessarily bound to the substantial form of the ship. So if I take I fly a plane into the ship of Theseus, right, and it blows up. I've got 1,000 tons of TNT. Like, it doesn't have to be something that like corresponds to reality, right? And it blows up. There would be no more ship of Theseus, but we would still have the matter of the wood. We may even still have some pieces of wood about. We'd also have a bunch of smoke, but there wouldn't be, the ship of Theseus wouldn't exist. It would be in small pieces. You see?
No. like what's your point? How does this negate the Thesis Paradox unto itself? Because the whole point of the Thesis Paradox is to ask, at what point during construction did the ship officially become the ship, and at what point during the deconstruction did it officially stop becoming the ship?
Because you're conflating and you're believing that the form is something innate to the reality outside of the human mind, when Aristotle never posits this. It's something of the mind. We can still speak of the ship of Theseus even after I've blown it up, right? But it's not something that is in the object itself. It's not like if you've ever written. I mean, I suppose you probably played around with Arduinos, like a struct or something in C. It's not like an object in Java where it just self exists like in a file. It's something else.
So you're saying the ship of Theseus, even if there is no ship, there's still a ship in your mind?
Yeah, in the same way that we think about Santa Claus existing in our mind as children, but it's not something that's correspondent to reality necessarily.
Okay, but you're talking about just fictitious things then?
Yes, but they're still in being, otherwise we couldn't think about them.
So even though fictitious things are fictitious, you're saying that they still exist unto themselves?
They exist insofar as their potentials in the mind, yes.
So does that mean Santa Claus is an invention or a discovery?
It is an invention. Well, I mean, it depends what we mean. We could actually say it's an extrapolation from St. Nicholas of Myra, in which case we could say, yes, it is correspondent to reality. But Santa Claus, in and of himself, is an invention.
Okay, so you're saying even though Santa Claus is a fiction and invention, Santa Claus exists in the mind.
Yeah, in the same way that we can talk about any fictional character from any fiction we've ever written.
This is an interesting question now unto itself, because we're getting into the problems with ontology. And I've always wanted to kind of go down this rabbit hole someday, because then you get to the question, what does it mean to say that, what is the difference between a thing that exists in the mind and a thing that doesn't exist at all? What does it mean to say there is no Santa Claus, or Santa Claus doesn't exist, or Santa Claus isn't real, when you just said that Santa Claus exists in the mind?
Yeah, in the same way that married bachelors do. It's about, as you'll see constantly in Aquinas, there is act and potential. There are acts which are actual in the world that we see. So, for example, the laptop that's in front of me and the microphone I'm speaking into, they are actual, and my thought about them is made actual insofar as it's correspondent to the matter and form that I perceive. And there are potentials. So, for example, I could say that there is such thing as a woman with a penis, right? This is not something that is true, but it is something that potentially exists in my mind. But it still has being insofar as I think about it. All false propositions, insofar as they're articulated, have being insofar as we can intellect about them, but they aren't correspondent to reality. That is what makes it a potential, and actually a complete falsehood, as opposed to an actual thing.
So I'm still really confused. Like, at the end of the day, if I say there's no such thing as Harry Potter, you could say, yeah, there totally is, because I can imagine him right now. Therefore, he exists in my mind, and he exists.
Well,
or there's a distinction now between like potential and actual.
Well, I could say that Harry Potter potentially exists in my mind, but we know that through reality, well, actually, there might be a guy called Harry Potter, right? But besides the point, we can say that the Harry Potter in the Harry Potter novels is not a being that is in actuality, right? But we can know him potentially and discuss him intelligently. That is why there are all of these people flying around with like broomsticks between their legs and throwing balls around, right?
So, because it sounds like you have like these two subcategories of existence, right? There's something that sort of exists in potential, exists in the mind, and then there are the things that exist in actuality or in action. I think I've heard this distinction before in potential and actuals. This sounds like a very Thomistic set of terms, if I'm not mistaken.
I would say that there's three, and that's God. But really, before we even begin to approach God, it's probably better to iron out act and potential, because this is important to his first way.
Yeah, I know I've heard this before in like other kind of Thomistic related discussions and essays. So that idea that, because that feels very confusing then to say that, Harry Potter exists in potential. Because to me, that's the same thing as saying Harry Potter doesn't exist. That which exists in your mind and imagination, but not in reality, is like the definition of a thing that isn't real and doesn't exist, right? So it's like very confusing to use that word existence for both of those.
You see, as I defined earlier, truth is the mind's correspondence to reality, and falsehood is when the mind doesn't correspond to reality. So you hold a falsehood when you say that Harry Potter exists as a flesh and blood person who went to a real school called Hogwarts, right? But we can still intelligently talk about Harry Potter in certain contexts. As I've said, many people do.
Okay, so it sounds to me like all I would say is when you speak of something that exists only in potential but not in act, I would just say, well, that's literally what it means to say something doesn't exist. Or you can change your language a little bit to say, no, it exists in potential. Harry Potter exists in potential, but there is no Harry Potter. Is that
that's not necessarily true, because I can describe something that can be made actual. So, for example, if I were to I have a book in my hand. It's the works of Philo of Alexandria, right? Mm-hmm. I thought about, like, let's discuss putting it on my bed, right? Like, I'm thinking about, like, potentially putting it on my bed. I actually put it on the table. It's false. But if I say, oh, I'm actually going to put it on my bed, I put it on my bed. It's actual, right? But when I'm holding it in the air, obviously, of course, you can't see me on the webcam. But, like, as I'm holding it in the air there, it's a potential. And when I put it on the table, it's still a potential, because I can still, as I've just done, pick it up and put it down.
So what is something in your view that does not exist? Can you describe something in that framework? Tell me something that does not exist.
You see, you can only describe that by analogy. So I could say something like non-being, but even like zero has a certain level of existence. It like, you see, this is why this is actually the reason why there are moral laws in the Old and New Testament, because all sin is a privation, and you can only describe it through positive commandments.
You need to actually tell me what doesn't exist. Because the big objection I have now is there is literally nothing in your view that doesn't exist, because anything you can describe and imagine in your head now by definition exists in potential and in thought.
Well, yeah, if I can think it does exist in potential, yes. But in terms of things that do not have being, we describe these by analogy, which is like, say for example, with a statue, right? Like a statue that's made of marble. I don't actually like draw the statue of David, or something like that. I go and I take a hammer and a chisel, and I chisel away the bits of marble to make it evidently clear that it is David, right? And it's the same with things that don't exist. We describe them by analogy and by chipping away things and, enclosing things through things that we can describe at the very least in potential, and often in actuality as well. That would be what logic is there to do.
And that's okay if you want to flesh that out, but the immediate reaction I have is I am now forbidden under that view to say X does not exist.
Well, no, because that would still exist.
I describe X, it is now existing in your mind, and it exists.
In potential, yes, but not in actuality, which is when we say it exists in common parlance is what we mean. We mean in actuality. But in terms of the thought that we have, any thought that we have ever is existent at the very least in potentiality.
Right, and that's very strange now, because literally everything you can imagine exists in this view.
It has being insofar as it's a potential, yes, but that doesn't mean it necessarily corresponds to the external reality that the mind is observing.
Okay, so then that's the big distinction now, because you're using that word existence to kind of describe both of those states, and that will get very confusing to a lot of people who are not familiar with that convention.
In being. It means in being. I don't know how. I mean, you see, like, actually, this gets into theology now, because God is actually pure being. But you see, we know that certain things are held in being because we can think about them, and we know that they are, like, insofar as they're in our mind, and we can observe them out in the world, which tells us their actuality. If I say that in common parlance something exists, we say, okay, this is in actuality. Right?
But
that's
what I'm saying. You'll be getting very confused looks by people in commonality when you use existence in that kind of way. So it's important to just clarify. I'm not saying you're a stupid dummy head. I'm just saying those terms are going to be very confusing to people who aren't kind of familiar with that Thomistic jargon. Does that make sense?
Well, of course. I mean, nobody would expect some random layperson to pick up the Principia Mathematica of Bertrand Russell and read it and then just all of a sudden get it. You need to know, like, you need some grounding in set theory first to actually get any idea of what he's saying. So, of course, it's going to be different. This is a discussion on Thomism.
Okay, and that's fair. I'm just trying to clarify, what you mean by these terms now. So I'm still confused, though, like what the objection is you have to the Thesis Paradox. Because at the end of the day, it's all about the question of when does the ship become the ship and when does it stop being the ship? And it doesn't matter about this idea of abstract potentials, because there are many like real world practical problems that fall into this sort of category. Like, when does a human become a human as opposed to just, a blob of cells and a zygote and that kind of thing? Actually,
you'd have real problems with human beings describing it in the same way, because human beings have essential and accidental elements. So, for example, all human beings have a body and a soul, right? Whereas the ship of Theseus is, as I've described, an artifact, which is a compilation of different substantial forms to reflect something that is accidental.
So that doesn't answer the question, though. When does the ship officially become a ship and stop being a ship?
Well, when I blow it up, it ceases to be a ship, and it becomes a ship when we observe it possesses the properties of the category ship. So, for example, it floats. It might have, if it's a sail ship, it would have, sails, right? It would be our observation and then categorizing it based on our observation.
So that sounded very close to the position I held. The ship itself is whatever we decide ship ought to mean, and when we want to apply the label according to our observation. So because my view, even though you sounded very close to it just now.
Yeah, but the problem you're having here is that you're denying the existence of categories and saying that they're only names. There is a real category called ships.
There's a real category called ships.
I can say in actuality that there are such things as ships and that there is more than one instance of it, yes.
And what makes a ship a ship?
The ability for it to float, bear passengers, and take them to particular places. That would just be one off the top of my head. Says who? Like, you see, this is why I think that you're actually saying that human beings decide reality as opposed to reality existing independent of human beings.
Decide definitions. You just arbitrarily assigned a bunch of properties that shall henceforth be labeled under the category of shit.
I don't think that human beings decide necessarily. You see, like, you're mixing up the word. We can marry the word to the particular category, but the category exists in and of itself. As I said with the redness, right? We can cogitate and invent like a string of letters that is called redness, and red, and describe an object as red, but the property itself exists regardless of whether or not human beings perceive it.
So it sounds like you're conflating perception with a thing that's intrinsic unto itself.
Yes, because how else could you do it? You don't just like yes, of course, the book that I have in my hand is always red and always will be red, obviously.
No, red is entirely a product of your mind. It has nothing to do with the book per se. If human beings all went extinct tomorrow, there would forever cease to be the idea of red or red in the universe. It is entirely a fabrication of your brain's interpretation of signals and neurons.
Saying that red doesn't exist because it's all just subjective by your own framework?
That perceptions exist. Are they objectively existing things?
They can be.
There is no more perception. There is no more red. If we all die tomorrow, the perception will cease.
No, it won't. Because it's not actually grounded on the perception. It's the reality that's there that we are perceiving that tells us that it is red. It is still red, regardless of whether or not somebody colorblind looks at it, or somebody who isn't. Like, this would be...
Oh, really? So
yeah, yes, really. Like,
say the colorblind person is wrong and your perception is right.
Yeah. I mean, it's not like it's a democracy. It's like, you see, I think Derrida actually did this, right? Like, he looked like, I've got a book in my hand. I've got the works of Philo in my hand again. I'm gonna squeeze my eyes together. It looks kind of different. It doesn't look like a square A4 book, but it still is, right? Like, I've just changed my perception, and yet it still remained a book, right? Like, you can't honestly you can't tell me, like, if I'm drunk and, you know, the girl is like at the bar that I'm chatting to is like, like blurring about, that I've just changed the reality that the woman is a white girl in her 20s. That's absurd.
And we're not talking about white girls in their 20s. We are talking about the subjective perception of red.
You're begging the question.
What question? Red is a perception.
It's not a perception. You're just doubling down. And, like, this is not the Thomistic perception. We're discussing Thomism.
Then your entire perception of color is absolutely at odds with everything we have known about the laws of physics and the brain's perception of electromagnetic radiation for the last 100 years.
It's not, though, is it? Because you dude. I'm sorry, man. Like, but I'm sorry, man. But, like, I am not, like, if every human being died today, it's not like the sun would stop, producing like waves on the electromagnetic spectrum which correspond to red. Obviously, it would keep going. Like, I mean,
I think this correspondence to red outside of your brain's perception.
I disagree.
And there are even experiments you can do where you can shine the exact same wavelength of photons into a retina, and the brain will perceive different color. This is an objectively demonstrable scientific and empirical fact.
Yeah, but that doesn't actually debunk redness. That's just saying that human beings perceive things wrong, which is why we have potentials.
Who are you to say that my perception of red is wrong? It is an entirely contextual thing. There are, like, classic optical illusions you can go download off the internet right now. You remember, is the dress gold or blue illusion? The exact same color pixels are perceived by different people to be different color.
Wait, so you're telling me that the fact that people have optical illusions and can have potentials that are false means that there is no actual reality in which to ground truth in?
There's no such thing as a false perception. That is an utterly meaningless statement. Perception simply is your brain's immediate interpretation of sensory stimulus. It has no truth value.
Okay, so if I were to call you Dayshawn instead of AnticitizenX and suggested that you're an African American, right? Would that be a false perception? Because I think it might be.
It is neither a true or false perception, because perceptions are Positions.
So you're happy for me to keep calling you Deshawn throughout this debate?
If you want to express it as a proposition, then we can assign a truth value to it. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm happy or sad about it. Your perception is whatever it is. But if you want to communicate effectively, you're going to have to follow agreed upon rules of language.
Okay, Deshawn. If there's no grounding in AnticitizenX with the man behind the computer talking to me right now, then why shouldn't I call you Deshawn?
After all, the grounding is our handshake agreement to call things by the same titles.
No, the thing is there's no reason why I should listen to you particularly. Like, why should I listen to you when we describe truth as false? Why can't false be true and truth be false?
If you don't listen, you will sound like an insane person, and nobody will understand.
Wait a minute. I'll sound like an insane person. Wait, so you mean that I won't actually have a view that corresponds to reality? That's very interesting.
You will be using words that fail to comply with English rules.
So you're telling me that in the land of the schizophrenic, schizophrenia is reality and the normal person is insane?
That is not even a coherent proposition. I don't even know what you said.
Well, okay, so we've said, okay, we're going to have this socially agreed upon idea of what reality is. Now, if we have people who running the society are mentally ill in an objective sense, because schizophrenia isn't just like some made up thing, right? And then you've got the one normal person there. If they agree to the fact that they're being gang stalked, if they don't agree to the fact they're being gang stalked constantly, does that make them insane? Because they appear insane to the paranoid schizophrenics that run the society?
What does this have to do with our use of language rule? Well, do you want to communicate effectively with people or not? If your answer is yes, we have rules we've agreed upon that you'll have to follow. If you fail to follow the rules, you will talk gibberish and we will fail to understand what your sounds have to do with anything.
That's discussing reality here. Like you've just said that these things are just agreed upon principles. And if the agreed upon principles are done by people who are like not living in reality, so they think that like I said, being gang stalked, right? If we had 100 people that were being gang stalked and then one person who knew that they weren't being gang stalked,
what does that mean?
Gang stalked. There's this group of schizophrenic people who think that they're constantly being watched and pursued. I think it's usually by the CIA or something like that. So if you have a group like you see,
like spied on, okay, monitored,
yeah, monitored, and there's of course no actual reality of this, right? And you join this society and you say, okay, I'm not being gang stalked. What you're essentially saying there is that there's no consensus there, and so you're going to appear insane. In fact, this actually sounds a lot similar to the words of St. Anthony of the Desert when he said, there will be a time when the same person will live with the insane, and they will point to the same person and say, you're insane.
What does schizophrenia have to do with the rules of English grammar?
It's to do with the underlying concepts which we've been discussing the whole time. This isn't about grammar. This is about correspondence to reality. We are describing a society where people do not live in correspondence to reality. And if somebody does live in correspondence to reality, what you are suggesting through consensus is that that person would be insane.
No, I said that if you don't follow the rules of English language, you will sound like of us who do. And it said nothing to do with whether or not your beliefs correspond to reality. It has to do with, are you just following the rules of language or not?
Okay, like that's not the case, though, because if I were to convince the entire chat to call you Deshawn, it would still be false.
It would fail to make sense to those of us who decide to give me a different name.
Wait, so you're telling me... So wait, so you're admitting to me that you're not Deshawn?
Now, again, you're using loaded language. Am I?
You are not Deshawn. You're not called Deshawn. No, you're not black and you're not from the Bronx, okay? You're not black and you're not from the Bronx. Like, I understand that, right? But if I were to convince everybody here that you were black Deshawn from the Bronx, right? And you would say, no, I'm not. You would be against the consensus there, wouldn't you?
Of course
yeah, and you would be right. But you've just said, oh, well, it's just agreed upon, bro. So... Do you not see the problem here?
You're conflating things that are true by definition with things that are true by matter of empirical consequence, though.
But you by definition are not Deshawn. You are AnticitizenX. You're AnticitizenX, not Deshawn. I'm calling you Deshawn. So, like, it's not true. This is something that comes out of the definition of who you are.
But what if I like that name? You can call me that now. Go ahead. Now it just became true by sheer fiat.
Okay, Jamal, I'll call you that instead.
What is that something wrong with that? Like, what do you object to that?
Well, what do I object to the fact that you're Deshaun? Because now I've actually changed my mind and I think that you're Jamal.
Yes, and now I can't talk to you anymore because you're being flaky and weird and communication is broken down. So there is a foundation in terms of actions and consequences that we can appeal to.
I mean, you're essentially saying that you should call me Deshaun, or you should call me AnticitizenX because I feel so.
I should anything. I said agree.
No, but you're saying like, oh, you'd appear like a crazy person, but isn't that ultimately like feelings? Like, oh, I feel kind of strange that this guy's calling me Deshaun, as you probably should, but that's not what makes it like false. What? Like, it's the fact that you aren't Deshaun. It's not the fact that like there's some consensus that decides.
Sure, I could change my mind tomorrow. I like that name. It now just became true by the sheer fiat of my decision to accept that label. And now I can invite everyone in this room to refer to me by that title from here on forth. I just made it true by collective agreement.
Okay.
There is no underlying reality other than our collective handshake agreement to use that title for me.
Right, okay, so like...
You object to that in some sense? Like, what do you find about that that's so disagreeable?
You're not Deshaun, that's what. You're AnticitizenX. Like
Except I'm sorry, guys. This condition where it would become true by consensus. I could change my profile right now to that name, and I could insist that everyone else call me that.
So, okay.
Why is that so terrible?
Because you aren't that. You aren't Deshaun. You're not a black man from the Bronx.
You never say anything about black man from the Bronx. We're just using a title for me.
No,
I'm a black man from the Bronx. That is an entirely separate of truth.
I just described it earlier on. Deshaun is a black man from the Bronx, and you are Deshaun, a black man from the Bronx, because it's consensus. As I described earlier,
I misunderstood that then, because there are two categories here. There's the title you give me, and then there are the sort of conditional facts about me, right?
No, because they're intrinsically linked. No, they're intrinsically linked, because when I say Deshaun, I'm referring to the black man from the Bronx, which is you, right? So you can't just separate the reality out from the word. This is my entire point, and you're just saying, okay, I'm now Deshaun. Don't you think this is like you kind of like admitting defeat?
You keep conflating the title with its underlying reality. Can you separate in your mind the words we call things and the facts behind them?
Wait, so okay, so you're telling me that there is like a signifier and then there's a logos underlying it that you were denying earlier on?
I never said otherwise.
We were arguing about this like half an hour ago.
That words, definitions, and realities are distinct. I've never said anything. That is the central thesis of everything I've been talking about, and you've said you reject it in some sense.
No, I've said that they map onto an exterior reality, which is what I was saying in the beginning. There is a logos. There is a reality which corresponds to the particular words. This is what I've been saying this whole time.
No. Words are whatever we want them to refer to.
But they aren't, though, are they, Deshaun? But they aren't Deshaun, though, are they? You're not a black man from the Bronx.
And now you just conflated them back again when I just told you they are separate things.
Don't you see the
you just are contradicting yourself now.
No, I'm not, because you see, you're conflating the meaning of the sounds with the actual category itself, which is not what it is, which has been my entire contention this whole time. Yeah, you did. You rejected the existence of abstract categories, which are represented by names that have actual existence, the categories themselves having the actual existence, and the signifier above it, which we refer to in language. This has been my entire point, Deshaun.
But then you talk about things like redness, which is a human perception. It is not an objective thing unto itself. It is entirely a fabrication of your mind that is actually independent of the actual photons. It is your brain interprets them contextually.
Okay, so you're telling me that there would be no such thing as the electromagnetic spectrum if all human beings died, because this is a perception we've made about reality?
I said nothing of the sort. I never said anything about the electromagnetic spectrum. I said red. Red is not the electromagnetic spectrum.
Red is on the electromagnetic spectrum, on the visible.
It is absolutely not, and whoever told you that is a damned liar.
What you mean? My physicist teachers in school, that they were lying to me when they told me that there was visible light.
Either he was wrong or you misunderstood him. Red is not This is a fact, dude. I can give you scientific studies where the same pixels are interpreted by the same people to be different colors under context.
Like, okay, so they perceive it different. Yeah, but you are telling me that the perception is what governs the category, which is exactly what I'm not saying. If you were to deny that visible light is under
perception category, I'm just saying perception is not an objective thing unto itself. It will not persist when people go away. Red is not an inherent property of apples. It is a property of your brain's interpretation of the sight of the apple.
Well, I mean, I'd agree it isn't an innate property of apples because we can have green ones, right? Like, yeah, like, but the thing is,
I didn't say apples in general. And you're sounding like an apple when it's red. That redness is nothing to do with the apple itself. It is about your brain's interpretation of the photons.
Yeah. No, I disagree. I disagree.
Hey, sorry, guys. Could I just ask a clarifying question? Because it seems like you've been going at this same topic. So, I think what I'm going to do is just ask both you guys to kind of sort of explain what the other's position is. So, AnticitizenX, what do you think he's saying when he says that red exists? And Elliot, what do you think he's saying when he says red exists? Like, what is the difference in kind of understanding?
No, thank you. I felt like there was going some circles there. So, like, the idea that redness is an inherent property of the things in the environment and not just purely a subjective interpretation of our brains to the stimulus. So the idea is that to say something is like objectively red would mean, in a sense, that if we all just died tomorrow, that redness would still be there. It'd be a property of the things in our environment.
Right.
So that is what it sounds like he's trying to say to me.
Okay.
Right.
So
and what would that mean, for example, if some sensorial, something that is essentially a qualitative thing, right? Like the red color on the rose, right? What would it mean for it to? Would you think for it to exist, regardless of any retinas perceiving the photons bouncing off, right?
Sorry, are you asking me?
Yeah.
So you're saying, what does it mean to say like a rose is red?
Yeah.
So I would say
hold on. Just there's a moment. Let's hold off what you're doing now, Legionnaire, until they're done having their discussion together. So I'm thinking we'll let this go for another 15 minutes or so.
Oh, no, I just.
Well, this is helpful. We got stuck in a loop, right?
Listen, like, I agree with him. Like, Andy, I think that it's actually very helpful to have a third party come and extrapolate things.
Okay, cool. Let's do that then.
No, I appreciate that because that's very, very helpful. So I would say it is technically an artifact of language that is misleading to say the rose is red. A far more correct thing to say is the rose appears red to me. And if other people can share that same distinctness of the perception, then you can use that as a foundation for communication and language.
Right.
Okay.
So it seems to me like you're saying that color itself, or more broadly speaking, universals themselves, or what the mind apprehends about reality, is just an artifact of the mind. That's what it seems like you're saying to me. If that's incorrect, please correct me.
I'm kind of hesitant to commit too much because I'm not sure what it means to say things like artifact of the mind per se, but perception is an entirely mental thing. It's not about the rose itself. It is your perception, your brain's interpretation of the signals.
All right.
Okay.
So, Elliot, what do you think about that?
Well, you see, I obviously believe that there is an inherent redness to red objects. And I think that we see one of the best examples of this in artists, particularly when they use connotation through color, right? So they observe red things. Say a red dress on a woman. We all know what a woman in a red dress wants. And he takes this and he applies it to a painting of the same red woman, or perhaps overemphasizing it, perhaps underemphasizing it to let you know how much she's trying to signal. This in itself is proof of the intellection and the generation of the form of redness, and its application to other things as a means of not only communication but signaling meaning. So I think we can certainly say that redness exists in the human mind, but the actual perception of red is exactly it maps directly onto the visible part of the visible light spectrum, that's just something like, I think it's 750 nanometers in the wavelength or somewhere around there, to suggest that red objects, those things which when they're reflecting light produce a wave that is 750 nanometers like in wavelength, to suggest that this process somehow ceases because nobody's there to see it, I happen to think is ridiculous.
So can I respond to that then?
Go ahead.
That idea that like 750 nanometers is red, right? That is true in the sense that if I just like put you in a dark room and I get an LED with a center wavelength of 750 nanometers, or a sharp laser beam, and I shine it in your eyeball, you will perceive red. But if I take that exact same 750 nanometers and contextualize it into an image, it will appear a different color. And there are, in fact, cultures in this world who make no distinction between blue and green, despite the fact that we have different words for them. And it is entirely a construct of their culture. It's called color theory and color perception. It's an entire field of study.
Yeah,
where
I
people
understand.
will perceive the same wavelength as a different color through entirely nothing more than their upbringing and the contextual colors and photons of the images around it.
Wait, so you're telling me that there are different potentials in human minds? That's rather interesting.
I said nothing of the sort, dude. I just said the
culture is
same
free to be wrong
750
as well.
nanometers will be perceived differently in different contexts, which means you cannot say it's objectively red when just the context around those exact same photons will be perceived differently.
Right. Okay. So if I look at a red thing and I say it's blue, there's no contradiction there at all.
First off, I just said it's an artifact of language thing. You can only say this is a thing that appears red to me. That is the proper way to describe it, but we don't do that in practice because it's
This is basic logic. Is the red
It's really
dude,
awful.
this is basic logic. Is the red thing blue?
You can construct that sentence in English language, but it is a misuse of language to ascribe that redness to the thing. You can only properly say the thing appears red to me.
So if I go to the policeman and say the guy who's stolen my wallet is in red joggers, right? Then that's a misuse of language.
Technically, yes, but they will interpret that correctly in the sense that if they perceive a person under similar conditions, they will perceive a red just the same way you did because it's a shared experience. And that's how language works.
So you're saying, so you're telling me that I'm abusing the English language whenever I describe any particular property of anything that I see that isn't like you see, even the nanometers thing is appealing to something that we perceive, right? So even that, like, you know what, I deny the existence of nanometers because if there were no human beings there to perceive it, there would be no nanometers.
So you're saying it's an abuse of language? Well, a lot of problems in philosophy are just ambiguities in language, yes. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that other than just the confusion it causes after the fact.
But it just sounds like you're describing nouns in general. Any kind of equivocal noun like dog or red or cat or human as like misuse of language. Like this is absurd. Like the whole this is absolutely absurd.
This is the basis of all color theory. I'm just talking about colors. If you want to talk about things like cats and dogs, then we get to the problem of the paradox of Theseus again, where it is not really useful to say that this is an objective cat-like thing. You can say there's a collection of material stuff, which to my perception seems to have all of the properties of a cat. And so cat is the label I'm going to assign to this perception. But that is a god-awful way of talking about the world. So we just say, this is a cat.
Or is it maybe that the perception in color theory, as you're saying, is just wrong? Is it perhaps that the scientists are wrong?
Is wrong? I don't know what that means.
Well, you're talking about all of these scientific studies, right? These studies that I know for a fact have problems with the replication crisis. Is it possible that these scientists are simply wrong?
And it's possible we all live in a matrix simulation. Assume
dude.
Dozens of peer-reviewed papers are in fact grounded on something, because you can experience this for yourself right now.
I mean, you see, that the problem is, right, is that the Thomistic tradition doesn't just have peer review, it has 800 years of peers reviewing it continuously. So I think I'm going to pick the more peer-reviewed side of things that says that red things are red.
Let me explain something. Your 800 years of quote-unquote peer review does not supersede scientific experiment that can be replicated right now for everyone to see for themselves.
Well, I mean, the thing is that that's exactly the same. You see, in fact, it's exactly the same as the gathering of knowledge, because science is just a description of a body of knowledge, scientia, right? So, in fact, actually, the survivability of the hypotheses and proofs of Aquinas against, say, color theory, which may have come about, I don't know, in the 19th century, actually testifies more to the truth. I mean, if you've read anything from, say, Nicholas Nassim Taleb, the famous statistical analyst from the University of New York, you'd know that theories that exist for longer tend to exist longer for a reason. It's called Lindy. And if color theory is something that has been in vogue for far less time than Thomism, and for that matter, Aristotelianism. So purely based on that, if we're talking about probabilistic things like science, because for a fact that science is probabilistic, you have to analyze results and come to conclusions with certain p-values. I'm going to rely on the approval by, in its essence, 2,500 years of different philosophers and thinkers, the Aristotelian, the 800 years of Aquinas' theory, over 150 years of peer review of color theory, particularly when it makes me come to conclusions like the picture I'm looking at isn't actually red, it's just my mind playing tricks on me.
So if I were to show you an optical illusion right now and you perceive red pixels as blue or green pixels as blue and yellow, what is the correct answer to the color of that thing?
I have got a potential in mind that is not correspondent to reality.
But what is the reality of your perception, your subjective perception?
Well, logos, which is being, that thing which is in being. What I'm perceiving is not in being.
There's no yellow, there's just photons mishmashing in your retina, and your brain then just perceiving something in that, interpreting it accordingly.
Yeah, and it's perceiving.
There's a yellowness inherent to a thing,
and it's perceiving it wrong. Like that's what I'm saying.
How do you perceive wrongly?
Like I said, if I started calling you Dayshawn and you're a black guy from the Bronx, I'm perceiving you wrong.
That's not a perception.
Yes, it is. Like if I look at you and I come to an incorrect conclusion, it is a perception. It's just an incorrect one.
If you look at me and you, honest to goodness, perceive a black guy, that perception is perfectly valid unto itself, whether or not that perception matches some external reality.
Wait, so if I'm completely hammered and I think that you're Dayshawn from the Bronx, then I'm right.
If you perceive me as black, that is your perception. It is a given. I cannot tell you your perception is wrong, because your perception simply is what it is.
Listen.
Whether or not that perception corresponds to some matter of fact outside your mind is a totally separate question from whatever it is you are perceiving in any given moment.
Yeah, you see, like, Andy, I'm just thinking about this. I think we're going to end up going around in circles for the next hour and a half.
Yeah, I was just about to ask if you guys wanted to continue, because it seems I'm thinking that, like, getting questions from the people in the chat, and like I said earlier on, like, if you guys want to send me any questions about scripture, be it like, I know there's a lot of edgy things in the Old Testament. I do a lot of studying of the Old Testament. So if you're concerned about, perceptions of rape or treatment of homosexuality or stuff like that, I have streams on that, and I can also talk to you in DMs about it if you're interested in finding out what the tradition says. AnticitizenX, are you cool with moving
yeah,
to the Q&A portion? Okay, cool.
And can I just say, like, it got a little heated, and there's a little, like, I genuinely appreciate you taking the time to come out and have a public conversation. So thank you.
It's no problem.
And I genuinely apologize if I said anything rude or mean. It gets a little heated, but then it's good to say.
Listen, no, you both have been spirited but respectful. It's been
like Anti, we're human beings. It's in our nature. It's something that human beings do, that they get heated on things that they care about, and I'm glad that I can talk to somebody who cares passionately about the particular topics they're discussing.
Well, so far I've only got one question that's been written in to Elliot from Dutch Idiot, and it says,
"Where is this? Can I read it?"
Yeah. So if you I'll copy and paste it into the chat.
Which chat are you going to copy it into?
Debate.
Into the debate chat.
Hey Dutch, I'm just going to unmute him so he can ask the question himself. Go ahead.
Okay. I'll read it myself. So, does $1 trillion bank account in Elliot's name exist? I wish it did, Because if we can think about the idea of such a bank account on his name, yeah, of course, I can think about a time where I might have $1 trillion. Of course, that's called fantasy. The thought itself has being. It's a potential. I can potentially have $1 billion, but is it actual? No.
Actually, I have a question for you, AnticitizenX, if you don't mind. So, for you, what does it mean to have an incorrect perception? Someone incorrectly perceived that thing, or I don't know.
Because there's kind of two ways to answer that. Because, like, in the strictest, absolute philosophical sense, your perception is what it is, right? If you're just looking at a wall and you see it melting and there's elephants dancing around, that is that is your perception. But whether or not that perception matches some like external fact is a totally different thing, right? So it's one thing to say, I see elephants dancing. It's another thing entirely to say, there are elephants dancing out there beyond my perception. So to say like an incorrect perception would be to see something that cannot be kind of validated through some sort of follow-up experimentation or observation.
And why is that?
And why is that?
Yeah.
Oh, that's just what it would mean, right? This is how I would.
But I'm asking. Maybe I'm trying to get at is the reason why there cannot be any experimentation done on that is because maybe the person's perception is occurring only within his mind and not outside his mind, meaning reality.
Well, like, what does it mean to do an experiment on your perception? Or I'm not sure I understand what you mean by that.
Yeah, because incorrect perception in that case would just means incorrectly perceiving reality, right?
Yeah. So to say like I am perceiving something that is not there is a good way. You know, the perception itself is not there. Is always a thing. You know, you can perceive whatever your brain decides to perceive at any given moment. But to say like I see dancing elephants in the room. But to say there are dancing elements, you know, how would you validate that? Yeah. Well, like, is there?
They are not. They are not
going on. Are they making noises? Are other people able to validate that perception, right, by experiencing it with me? So, if the answer to all that is like no, then you could say like, well, your perception is wrong. But then but you also got to be careful because in the strictest sense, I would say that's not that it's just a nuance of language in that sense. So strictly speaking, your perception is what it is, but whether or not that perception corresponds to reality in sense is a kind of a different question. So you could say your perception is wrong in that sense.
Sure, but if we were to
strictly, I would cringe at that. Sorry.
Sure. So just to be clear, if we were to say that there is such a thing as correct perception and incorrect perception, then that would just mean like the person is not correctly perceiving what is there. You said it's not there, so meaning it's not where, it's in reality or outside the mind or whatever is out there outside the mind, right? Okay, sure. I just
tend to say you got to be careful because the words you use in this context can quickly get confusing if you aren't like very careful to differentiate between like your perception and the world outside it, right?
Sure.
So.
All right, we have another member who I think would like to ask a question. Doug.
Sure. Doug, go ahead.
Go ahead, Doug.
Yeah, I have a lot of questions, actually. I don't even know where to start. The first objection I'd like to make, even though I'm not an Aristotelian, I think the problem with the Theseus ship example that Anti-Citizen brought up is that it's actually committing what's known as the Continuum Fallacy. Just saying, well, because you can't really draw a hard line between where the ship starts and the not ship ends, or that ships don't really exist. But I think it would be more proper to say that, well, perhaps ships are just a fuzzy set, right? It could be the case that there's some ambiguity about whether a object is a member of the set ships, right? Another thing I would like to ask is I would like to pose this question to Elliot. Okay, so this is the argument. I'm actually going to pull it up. This wasn't originally my argument, but I think it's a pretty good argument. So the argument goes like this: if God exists, then God is a morally perfect being. The world is morally imperfect now. If God is a morally perfect being, and his actions cannot decrease the degree of moral perfection of the world. If God is a morally perfect being, then prior to God creating anything, the world or the metaphysical state of affairs was morally perfect. If prior to God creating anything, the world was morally perfect and the world is morally imperfect now, then the actions of God have decreased the degree of moral perfection of the world. Conclusion 1. If God exists, then his actions cannot decrease the degree of moral perfection in the world. Conclusion 2. If God exists, then prior to God creating anything, the world was morally perfect. Conclusion 3. If the world is morally imperfect now, then if prior to God creating anything, the world was morally imperfect, then the actions of God has decreased the degree of moral perfection in the world. If prior to God creating anything, the world was morally perfect, then the actions of God have decreased the degree of moral perfection of the world. If God exists, then the actions of God have decreased the degree of moral perfection in the world. Conclusion, God does not exist. I'll put this really long syllogism in the chat just so you can...
I appreciate that, but I think that the thing that we have to talk about here, I don't know where you're going to put it, but I noticed that you're describing God as morally perfect. And of course, moral is a term that has changed meaning in the last 250 years. So Immanuel Kant's deontological view has dominated the categorical imperative, right? Before this wasn't so much the case, and likewise it wasn't the case with Aquinas. If you guys want a contemporary book to read on morality, I recommend Alistair MacIntyre. I'll type his name, Alistair MacIntyre. His book After Virtue. So before this, I mean, there are, of course, people who held to a deontological view of ethics, usually Jews and Muslims, before this. But in Aquinas' view, to be moral is to follow rules such that our bodies are in a greater state of being. So sin is a description of...
law theories.
Yeah, but allow me to articulate it for everyone else, around here. So sin, according to St. Augustine, likewise Aquinas says with him, is a privation. When we sin, we are decreasing our being. Now, moral actions are those which correspond to our being. We are in a greater state of being when we are good than when we are bad. We see this, right? Porn stars die at 35, whereas women who are in stable marriages most of their life live a very long time. You can see this in a very actual sense, but it applies to the action itself and how it changes the human being. And this is inherently linked to the habituation of human beings. Now, God himself simply is. Ego imi, as it is said in the Gospels, right? I am that I am, is also said in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14. So he has the definition of being pure being. Now, human beings know that morality corresponds to that which makes people greater in being. Now, as pure being, God cannot grow in being, nor can he lose being. Therefore, God isn't, strictly speaking, moral. We only use, when we're speaking of God being good in, say, Psalm 135 of the Old Testament, we're speaking analogically. What we perceive as good comes from the hand of God. Now, how do we explain evil? Because really, this is like if God real, why bad thing happen question. It is because evil, and this is actually a large focus of both the Old and New Testaments. It is that evil itself permits great things to come about. You cannot have good without evil. You cannot build your muscles without suffering the necessary physical evil of pushing the barbell over your head if you're going to do an overhead press. St. David of Wales would never have existed if his mother wasn't raped, in spite of the fact that she was a celibate nun, right? You cannot, the whole existence of moral evil is there to permit the existence of more moral goods. In the same way that we trim back and prune a shrub in order that it may grow in a more orderly and beautiful manner.
Okay, thanks, Dog, for asking that question. Stargate Monkey, you had a question for somebody. Let me unmute you.
Hello, is my mic working? Yeah.
Hear you loud and clear.
Okay. I missed the first half of this debate, so what I'm asking about might have already been covered. So apologies if it is. It was about when you were talking about perceptions earlier. I was just wanted to kind of a clarification question from Elliot. So I'm just asking what it kind of, when you're kind of looking at like an optical illusion of some kind, like for example, like a magic eye, or there are various like color optical illusions where you perceive colors that if you measure them using like like an RGB value on a computer screen, it seems that they're not actually changed at all. What kind of thought process are you using to explain what's actually happening there? Are you kind of deriving the truth of the matter from facts that you derive from other perceptions before, or like a probabilistic type thing, or are you using some other kind of process entirely to say, to explain the optical illusion as such, like why there's a different color there?
Well, we know that what red looks like. When I look at an image, I know what red looks like, and it may be the fact that it may be 25500 on the screen, but I know that I'm perceiving it wrong. It's not fitting into the category of red, in spite of the fact that it has the physical properties that correspond to that. So I'm just saying, it's, you're perceiving it wrong.
So who's perceiving it wrong? That you're perceiving the color in your head wrong, or that the color that you're seeing on the screen is actually on the screen, but there's something else happening to either, like the computer's wrong, or I'm not quite sure what you're saying there.
The computer's completely correct, right? It is portraying red, but I'm looking at it wrong.
Okay, so when you say you're looking at it wrong, do you mean that you're consciously doing something to make it look wrong, or that just that something in your brain is either maybe broken or is just kind of computationally?
For whatever reason, there is, a lack of a privation in the sense. It's the same way that when I look at the book, the Philo example that I've got here, I can squeeze my eyes together and it's going to look a lot darker, right? Like there's nothing stopping this Philo volume from being dark green with white text and some lighter green text on it. It's just that I'm looking at it wrong because I'm squeezing my eyes together. Okay. And it would be the same with somebody who has color blindness.
Okay, so what I'm trying to get at there, I guess, is saying, what do you use to determine which is the right scenario for seeing red, as opposed to like an optical illusion where you don't see what you expect? So like what are you using to say that the optical illusion is wrong, as opposed to the quote unquote normal situation where you're looking at the monitor without the setup? What are you using there to derive that?
Pre-existing experience, and as well as what people have told me as well. So like I can communicate the idea of red, say through, let me think of an example. So like you can use the motif of red and communicate that to somebody who's got color blindness, and they will notice, red. They might not be able to perceive red, but in, say, a particular painting, they'll see grey, and they will know what it's referring to. So they will have, in a sense, an idea of redness, although they might not be able to perceive it.
Okay. I think you're kind of like appealing to like a referent type thing at that stage. So you're saying that the thing that your experience is kind of, there is actually a redness that I'm perceiving there. But you're lacking the ability to process that kind of color at that point.
Yeah. I'm saying that redness as an objective is an objective property, although it doesn't have existence in and of itself independent from red objects.
Okay, so would that mean that you would say you would commit to it being like a mental thing as opposed to like a thing outside in the world of itself?
Yeah, in the same way I'd say that potentials are something in the mind.
Okay. Well, it's not my debate, so I could be here forever.
Yeah, kind of a follow-up question to that then. Because, like, suppose I was tetrachromatic, and I look at a rose, which you perceive as red, and I perceive, because I'm going to have another neuron firing it, and my brain's going to have to interpret that somehow. Who's right in their perception to say that this is red or this is some other color?
Well, like I said, you've got a different level of perception. It's still red, but you're going to see something else.
But it's not red anymore. It would be something else. My brain would
and your brain would be wrong.
So why does the trichromatic person get to be right, but the tetrachromatic one is wrong?
Well, because the trichromatic person is the person who's defined the category red. It exists in the mind, right?
So the person who is right is the one who defined it?
No, because it still has existence in itself, like in the mind. right? It would still be red, dependent of what we say, because red in and of itself corresponds to something that is objective in the world, the substantial form of the wave, right? We can just simply perceive it wrong. If I was to say have an A added onto the RGB perception that I'm having, right, this wouldn't change the fact that there's an R there.
No, but I'm saying if I were tetrachromatic and I show you something that's like yellow, it does not correspond to any particular peak in our retina sensitivity. I'm just tetrachromatic and you are trichromatic. Both of us are going to perceive different colors. Who are you to say that you're yellow, that it's yellow, and why would that supersede my statement that it's phlebe?
I mean, it doesn't have to supersede your category, because phlebe or yellow could be the exact same thing. The signifier doesn't matter.
I'm saying we would both perceive the exact same object completely differently.
Yes.
And you say yellow is an inherent property of it, and I say I don't.
Well,
why is it intrinsically yellow? Or are we both right, or are you right and I'm wrong? Like, who's right and who's wrong in this case?
Well, it really depends on the perceivers in question, right? Of course. like, let me think about how to approach this. So you've got someone who can see in four spectrums of light. You have someone who can see in 3. So I look at the icon actually that's on my shelf. St. Nicholas the Wonder Worker, and he's got a yellow background, and the tetragrammaton, no, I'm not going to say that, looks at that and says it's not yellow, it's phlebe, right? Now, in my perception, I know what corresponds to yellow. It is yellow. He can say phlebe, whatever phlebe corresponds to in his categories and in his perception. If it corresponds to that category, then it is.
So it sounds like you're saying we're both right then.
Well, it would entirely depend on what we meant by phlebe and what we meant by yellow.
Phlebe is the experience I get when looking at this particular flower, which to you appears yellow.
Actually, I've just learned this. Apparently, tetrachromatism is a disease, so we'd actually be describing a privation. So actually, the
disease.
Oh, I just received a DM, someone telling me that. So you're actually talking about privation. So yeah,
there are creatures in the world that are naturally tetrachromatic, though.
Yeah, but in terms of they can't actually intellect. We didn't get around to this, but they can't actually intellect. So the color red would actually be irrelevant to them.
How is that a disease, though? Are you saying humans?
No, I'm saying that I'm saying that the discussion of abstract objects like red is irrelevant to a dog or a snake.
Yeah, I'm also saying, though, hypothetically, tomorrow we could have grandkids that just evolve some mutation that makes them tetrachromatic, and they could just go on and over 100 years replace everybody, and that would be the new normal in human perception. That could hypothetically happen. It probably won't, but it's in principle it can happen.
And then we go back to the problem of what if I live in a
I got this. So go ahead, guys. Go ahead and finish out. Go ahead and finish this up.
Like you see, then we get to the same problem of what happens if I'm living in the schizophrenic colony with the gang stalkers, right? Like, we know that tetrachromatism is a disease.
No, it's not.
Okay.
That. You can live a perfectly normal, healthy life.
So you're telling me that I could like hack the arms and legs off of every human being on Earth, and we'd live in a nugget-topia?
I'm just talking about a natural mutation where some human beings are tetrachromatic. It's not a disease. It's just an aberration.
Listen.
Okay, hold on, guys. We got a new question on the question on the table. You guys can go around this for. I'm going to unmute Jonathan. I think he has a question for AnticitizenX. Hold on.
Mm-hmm. I actually had one for both of them, but the second one's really short. So the first one for Anti-Citizen is how do you respond to Aquinas's argument for motion? And then for my hello Elliot, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin for Elliot?
Oh, that was kind of mean.
I can actually give like who do you want to answer first? Because I can talk about the angels.
Either one. I love Elliot.
Oh wait, the angel thing was like a big sort of Thomistic issue, wasn't it? Am I interpreting that?
No,
right?
Well, it's a meme. It's a meme.
It's
a bit of a meme.
Yeah, you perceive that incorrectly. Yeah. So angels, by their nature, are incorporeal. They don't consist of matter. They are, as Aquinas calls them, does Aquinas call them pure form? He certainly calls them incorporeal, right? And so it is impossible to speak of angels dancing on top of a pin, because insofar as they exist by default, they don't actually have matter, so they couldn't. Now, if they were to manifest, as they often do, in, I think what they called bodies of like wind, I can't remember exactly what they're referring to. This would be entirely under the judgment of the angel, so it could be one, it could be all of them. Also, actually, I see a question related to this from Zyron in the chat.
That's a good answer.
How did angels...
All of them.
AnticitizenX, you want to answer the other question that Jonathan had for you?
It was, how do I respond to the argument from motion?
Yeah, are you aware with it or familiar?
It's been a while since Sorry, say that again?
Are you familiar with it, or?
I've listened to it a few times. I am qualified enough on all the nuances to give like a super definitive.
Yeah,
it sounds a lot like the usual cosmological arguments. So a lot of kind of the same responses apply. That you just rewind the clock of the universe, and the idea of like first mover or first moment in time ceases to have meaning because space and time start getting all wrapped up, and then there's just a point where it stops being meaningful in our language to describe physics in those kinds of terms, where space and time stop being separate things. And then the idea of causality and things causing things before things, again, a lot of these ideas are not really meaningful when you start rewinding the clock to the earliest moments of the Big Bang. So that's sort of my very hand-wavy response. I don't necessarily...
Yeah, no worries. It's a topic in and of itself, and it'll probably derail a bit the conversation.
Yeah.
But we can definitely, talk about it after maybe the Q&A. But I was wondering, does anyone else have any questions, Andricus?
I haven't seen any, so if we just want to move to a completely open, I think the Q&A is done at this point. I think the discussion,
sure, absolutely, yeah.
If we just want to move to a different room or something, I think we've accomplished what we set out to accomplish.
Yeah, sure. We can move to like general or something.
I just want to say again, thanks to Elliot and Anti-CitizenX both for a really lively discussion, really respectful attitudes, and thank you both for coming tonight.